Hi, everyone. Can you hear me now? Yep. Okay. So, yes, thank you so much for this great invitation. It's a real pleasure to be talking today in this network. I've been following the International Tree Mortality Network since its inception. So I'm glad to be today here. So I'm Daniel Zuleta. I'm a postdoc working with ForestGEO and the whole group of ForestGEO and the next generation ecosystem experiments topics on pantropical patterns of tree mortality. And today I'm going to be talking about tree death and damage links in tropical forests. But first of all, I always I would like to recognize that, of course, there are many people involved in this work, including more than 50 field assistants and many other collaborators from the ForestGEO network and the national labs at the US national labs involved in the ForestGEO and NGE Tropics project. So, well, okay, as you may know, tropical forests store huge amounts of carbon. For example, here we have the GPL 2020 map of above ground biomass, which is derived from a combination of Lancet products and trained with spaceborne and airborne LiDAR and field inventories. But these estimates are highly uncertain. And as you can see here, this uncertainty can go up to 150 megagrams per hectare in some regions. This is just in terms of current estimates of biomass, but predictions of future carbon storage are even more uncertain. For example, this is a projection of the increase in biomass in response to 250 ppm of CO2. And although the tropics seems to continue storing the largest amount of carbon on the left, the uncertainty on the right is quite large. So the question here is why are these estimates too uncertain in the tropics? And many studies have pointed out that the lack of an accurate or a better representation of the carbon turnover, especially tree mortality in vegetation models, is an important source of this uncertainty. In fact, we have all seen that the spatial variation in tropical forest biomass is largely driven by differences in tree mortality. And this is basically because changes in tree mortality occur more rapidly than changes in growth or recruitment, which are the two other demographic processes. And in addition to that, the high species diversity that we find in the tropics also imply a wide range of responses to a given driver, which overcomplicates its inclusion in the models. Because we cannot just simply collapse all this huge diversity into 2 or 3 PFTs in these models or plant functional types. So a better understanding of the causes and consequences of tree mortality is needed to better predict the future carbon cycle, the future responses of the future forest compositions, and the future responses to global change. And with this aim, ForestGEO initiated a series of annual mortality censuses in these 8 sites across the tropics, where we basically follow cohorts of living trees as a subset of all the trees in these sites, and assess their vigor and other factors that are likely to be associated with future tree deaths, such as the presence of insects, wounds, liana loads, damage, etc. We also collect we also collect data on the physical state of dead trees, which is traditionally known as the modes of death, in which trees found dead, broken, and uprooted are generally attributed to mechanical factors such as winds, and dead trees found standing are attributed to physiological factors such as droughts or pests. In the case of damage, we collect 2 main variables. One is the living length along the main stem, or the main trunk of the tree, main stem of the tree, and the proportion of newly broken branches on living trees, right? So our damage metric includes branchfall, includes breakage, trunk breakage and also the woody decay in standing trees. But to be able to convert these two variables into volume losses and therefore biomass losses, we needed a characterization or a description of how the trunk and crown volume is distributed from the base to the top of the trees. So we use terrestrial laser scanning and quantitative structure models to fit a joint allometric model for trunk and crown volumes that allow us to estimate the volume contained up to a given height in average tropical trees. So in the figure on the right, we have the relative height in the x-axis and the relative volume, cumulative volume contained up to a given height in the y-axis. So for example, a tree with a reduction of 50% of its height is predicted to have lost more than 20% of its total woody volume in both the branches and the trunk. We then use these cumulative volume profile models, the species wood density as is traditionally done, and the damage related variables recorded in the field to have an estimate of the biomass or the above ground biomass of the tree, taking its current damage level into account. And then finally, we just, the above ground biomass losses from living trees over time were calculated as the differences in AGB across censuses using repeated measurements of these damage related variables. So with this data, we first study the relative importance of mortality risk factors. Then we then evaluate the degree to which these risks correspond to traditional modes of death, and finally estimated the implications of damage for forest carbon fluxes. Regarding our first goal, we assessed how each of these conditions in this table influences the probability of death depending on the tree species, and defined as at risk those trees with more than twofold probabilities of death. In this table, we have all the conditions and associated risks that we evaluated, and I'm not going to talk about its specifics, but I will leave the table here in case we want to come back at the end. For each risk factor, we estimated its impact on the overall mortality of the forest, meaning how much of the stand mortality is excess mortality associated with the risk, and then ranked all the risk factors based on this impact metric. So we explored 19 mortality risk factors in total and found that light limitation and those risks related to tree damage, highlighted in red here, were the most impactful in these forests. Being small, limbed, and defoliated ranked next in importance. And importantly, these results were qualitatively similar across 6 of these sites, and even when we only used trees larger than 10 centimeters in DBH to perform the results, the analysis. Okay, regarding our second objective, we found very limited evidence that supports these traditional links between risk factors and the modes of death. In this core diagram, I showed the association between the modes of death and the risk factors for 2,100 trees that we found dead in this study. The lower half of the circle showed the risk factors, including those trees that died without risks, while the upper half section indicates their modes of death after 1 year. And as you can see here, dead trees had multiple risk factors 1 year before that do not necessarily align with this traditional inference from modes of death. Okay, so having established damage as the most common condition preceding tree death, we wanted to evaluate its role in the forest carbon cycle, both empirically and using a demographic vegetation model. So we first compared the relative contribution of dead trees and damaged but living trees to total above ground biomass losses. we all know that that traditionally we only assumed as biomass losses those trees that died. So we also, my main object, or our main objective here, was to compare what was this contribution from trees that remain alive. And interestingly, we found that on average, across 7 of these sites, damaged trees contributed to almost half of these losses, 42%. And considering that that every year, or that the proportion of trees that get damaged is much higher than the proportion of trees that actually died every year in tropical forests, this result means that that the amount of biomass lost from the few trees that die, it might be almost equivalent to the amount of biomass lost from the many trees that get damaged but do not die or remain alive, right? At least at the 1 year time census interval, right? Of the 1 year time scale, sorry. So you might be wondering, okay, wait, you just showed that damage is one of the most important conditions preceding tree death, right? Which is right. And as you can see in this figure, the probability of dying significantly increased with previous tree damage in all sites. However, there are still some trees in this region that can lose up to 40 and maybe 50% of their previous damage and still survive at the 1 year timescale. So the question here is what if we just wait longer to check if those damaged trees in the gray portion of this pie plot die after 2, 3, or maybe 4 years, right? If damage and mortality are strongly coupled, AGB losses from tree mortality will just be the time integrated estimate of AGB loss for each tree. So I repeated the analysis at the different time census intervals. In this figure, we have the result I just showed at the 1 year time scale, with 42% of total biomass losses corresponding to damaged but living trees. And interestingly, we found that even at longer time census intervals, alive damaged trees contribute to between 32 to 34% of biomass losses in these forests, which I claim this might be very important and correspond to AGB losses that are not captured by long-term studies traditionally focused. Oh, what was it? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can hear.
Okay, that was weird. So I say that this corresponds to AGB losses that are not captured by traditionally focused studies that are focused only on tree mortality. Okay. We next incorporated these damage and mortality links into the FATES demographic vegetation model to assess the broad implications of damage for the carbon cycle and competitive dynamics between plant functional types. This work was led by Jesse Needham, who is a research scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And the damage model, this new damage model in FATES is basically represented as a reduction in crown area and biomass of leaves, reproductive tissues, sapwood, storage, and structural pools. And the take-home message here from these simulations are that crown damage causes decreases in growth rates that match the observations in BCI. It also leads to increases in carbon starvation mortality. And importantly, it alters the competitive dynamics between plant functional types because trees that can recover from crown damage outcompete those that cannot recover, meaning that there are underlying important implications for the composition of future forests. Okay, so just to wrap up, using a broad suite of observations on multiple tropical forests, here I show a ranking of importance of mortality risk factors. I think next steps should include experiments that focus on resolving the causal links between the drivers, this risk, and their physiological consequences in order to improve these predictions of the fate of tropical forests. And in this case, for example, we went down to the Amazon and sampled 60 trees for non-structural carbohydrates across a gradient of different damage levels. And we found, so this is very preliminary analysis, and we found that the percentage of starch significantly decreased in more damaged trees, but it only happens for trees of species with low wood density, but not for trees with high wood density. This is a work in progress, of course, but it's just to exemplify these likely links between these mortality risk factors, in this case damage, and the physiological consequences. Okay. Importantly, we also showed that damage is a key factor in forest dynamics because it was the dominant mortality risk and accounted for important losses in surviving trees. I think, of course, there's so many other things to explore here, but the first thing to do may be to try to work on a more comprehensive quantification of these mortality and damage links, including a better quantification of the damage, not only from these models, but maybe in the field, and also, and of course, also the timing between biomass losses from damage versus biomass losses from mortality, which might be different, and of course vary depending on the biogeography and disturbance regimes. We are working on a bunch of different analyses related to the causes and consequences of tree mortality, but I just wanted to quickly feature a new initiative that is particularly relevant to this group. We recently established a working group on pantropical tree mortality. This working group is part of the Alliance for Tropical Forest Science, or ATFS, which is a new partnership funded by the US National Science Foundation under the Acceleration Science, or AccelNet, and includes around 12,000 plots across 11 forest monitoring networks in the tropics. So this working group resulted from the first multi-network mortality workshop that we carried out in Cartagena right after the ATBC conference early this year, and aims to enhance a collaborative research and to generate new knowledge and the pantropical patterns of tree mortality. With that, I would just like to thank you all, and to the more than 50 field systems that have worked with us in the collection of the forest data related to the ForestGEO mortality censuses. Thank you.
So, checking that it's going to advance properly. So thank you very much for the invitation to present today. Oh, yes, it is working. It's my pleasure to talk to this group about tropical forest mortality. My name is Helena Muller-Landa. I'm a staff scientist at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, where I've been for the last, almost 15 years now. I started out working more in community ecology and theoretical community ecology, and then when I came to STRI, as we call it, I was in charge of a forest carbon program for tropical forests, so that got me more into the ecosystem side of things. And 8 years ago now, I started a program with monitoring forests here in Panama with drones. And one of the things we've found that really useful is for monitoring tree mortality, and that's the work I'm going to be talking about today. First, as background, this will look a lot like one of Daniel's slides, but tropical forests exhibit really high spatial variability in above ground biomass carbon stocks. And that's important because they're a very large carbon stock globally, and they're also responsible for a lot of the net carbon uptake from anthropogenic emissions right now. And so a key question, there's kind of two key questions that I think, sorry about that. Sorry, I've never had this problem with this before today. Okay, so we can think of above ground woody biomass as being the product of above ground woody productivity and above ground woody residence time. So kind of what amount of wood is produced each year and how long is that wood staying in the system, at least in old growth forests, which is what I'm thinking about here in majority of tropical forests still, although maybe not for long. And above ground woody residence time is determined mainly by tree mortality rate. So obviously if trees die sooner or at a faster rate, then the above ground woody residence time is lower. So if we look at spatial variation in forests, tropical forests, a lot of that is shown on the right. It's a lot of the variation in biomass stocks among mature tropical forests is driven by variation in stem mortality rates, much more so than woody productivity. So woody productivity does vary among sites, but most of the variation we find across sites is about variation in mortality rates. So that means spatial variation in tropical forest biomass is mainly about tree mortality rates. And then what's driving that variation in tree mortality rates really? Well, ultimately, disturbance rates, storms, fire, drought, and flooding interacting with plant functional composition, soils, and local climate, which determines the vulnerability. Now, global vegetation models do terribly poorly, actually, at reproducing spatial variability in tropical forest biomass. Now, these figures are from the CMIP-5 model, so there's now CMIP-6 models, but they really don't do much better. And they do even worse at reproducing variation in above ground woody residence time. And this is mainly something that I think is not that actually unusual for temperate forests either, is that the representation of tree mortality rates in these models is very crude and relies mainly on background mortality rates, which means, of course, it's not capturing that spatial and temporal variation. And that then means that these models aren't going to be any good at really predicting or understanding how global change is affecting tropical tree mortality rates. And we have reason to think that that's a big issue. There's multiple hypotheses for how increasing temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, the increase in lianas or woody vines, increased fire, are potentially increasing tropical tree mortality rates. And there's also evidence from some sites, although not others, finding some increases. In particular, the brown line in this figure is from work in the Amazon, network of sites in the Amazon, finding increasing tree mortality rates over time. So what determines tree mortality, tropical tree mortality rates, and specifically their spatial and temporal variation? On the one hand, disturbance rates, so storms, winter, lightning, landslides, drought, fires and flooding, although fires and flooding are a relatively small fraction of tropical forests. Secondarily, environmental conditions like climate, topography, and soil. And then also plant functional composition, how drought tolerant, how wind throw tolerant are the species? Do they have fast or slow life histories so that they tend to have a live fast, die young or life history, or a grow slowly, live a long time life history? What's the abundance of lianas and how vulnerable are they to particular mortality risk factors? With tens of thousands of tropical tree species, the species and functional composition is a real factor, major factor. Now, there's some big challenges of studying tropical tree mortality on the ground. So the mortality rates are generally quite low, 0.1% to 5% per year. So you need to observe a lot of trees to get good estimates of mortality rates. The mortality rates vary with tree size and species. Most species are rare, very low sample sizes for the largest trees, which are by far the most important for woody residence time. So, if you think about basically for getting woody residence time, how long that wood is sticking around, you want a size weighted average. So the biggest trees count the most. And then standard census intervals are 5 to 10 years, which tells you the kind of mean mortality rate. But if you want to say, how does this dry year, or how does this warm year, how do mortality rates differ? You can't say much about that with 5 or 10 year census interval. And as Danielle's talk highlighted, decomposition obscures any evidence of mechanisms very quickly. So in a 5-year census interval, you can literally have a tree die and completely disappear in tropical forests with high decomposition rates. So as I said, 8 years ago, I started a program of investigation here in Panama with drones. And I want to credit the kind of STRIDE drone team, as I would call them. So Milton Garcia is our lead technician on the drone team, and Pablo Ramos and Paulina Villarreal have been assisting with that. Jonathan Dandois is the postdoc who kind of got this all started. And we've used a variety of drones over the years, from kind of hobbyist things to a 3DR drone and then a Phantom Pro for a long time, as well as some other drones. And the work I'm going to be talking about today is about quantifying fine-scale temporal and spatial variation in canopy disturbance and thus tree mortality with drones. So we've been doing monthly flights since October 2014 on a 50-hectare, so 1 kilometer by half a kilometer plot on Barro Colorado Island in Panama. where all trees above 1 centimeter in diameter are censused regularly every 5 years. So this is an orthomosaic of that plot. So all trees seen from above from October 2014, the first date we studied this actually. And you can see that we have quite high, well, actually you can't quite see quite how good it is. So we have about 7 centimeter spatial resolution in this, and it's in the more recent flights, we've got 3 centimeter resolution. And you can really see every crown in this. Now, not only are drones amazing tools, but the photogrammetry software, as those of you who work with drones know, is if anything, almost even more amazing. So I can take this set of photos and put them together into not just that orthomosaic, but also into a 3D point cloud of the entire forest, such as we see here, and thereby get canopy elevation surface models. And if we look at the canopy surface model, so here brighter colors are higher elevation at 2 different time points, and then we difference them, we can see where basically a tree has fallen or a branch has fallen or something's happened that's led the canopy to drop greatly. And then by visual inspection of the associated orthomosaics, we can get a sense of what happened exactly. So in this case, we can see that there's a tree that fell and some other things happened here too. And so Raquel Araujo is the postdoc who led this first paper I'm going to talk about, which came out in Biogeosciences last year. She visually then checked every one of the identified disturbances and classed it either as a tree fall, a branch fall, so part of a crown came down, or a standing dead tree decomposing. From that, we do acknowledge that we probably missed some standing dead trees that just decompose too slowly to kind of trigger our threshold for being a canopy mortality event. But most of the trees seem to be going down in tree falls. And so we're getting those quite comprehensively. So looking across, this is again the full 50-hectare plot, so 1 kilometer by half a kilometer. And here we have all the canopy disturbances detected over a five-year period from October 2014 to November 2019, and with their classification as tree fall, branch fall, standing dead, or couldn't quite tell. There was also 1 long interval due to lapse in funding where we didn't attempt to classify gaps because we were concerned about whether we really had the information to do that. Now, when we look at this, we found and put it all together, and we calculate this as kind of the area disturbed per time, in this case per month, the percent of the area disturbed per month. We see that there's very strong temporal variation across months and across time periods in the disturbance rates, with much higher rates in some time periods than others. And indeed, from people who were on the island at that time, most of these disturbances didn't just happen in this 1-2 month interval, but actually probably on a single day when there was a big storm. So if we had daily data, we'd be able to do even better, but I think it'll be a while before we get there. And then we asked, well, what can we say about that temporal variation? Is it related to something about the rainfall or the wind speed, which are the main things people think about as relating to tree falls in this forest? Rainfall, partly because it adds weight to canopies and makes the soils less stable. And wind speed, of course, is a force that's blowing trees over. Now we have a strong seasonality in this forest. It's a seasonal moist tropical forest with a 4-month dry season from mid-December to mid-April approximately. And so if we look at rainfall, a 7-day mean and 30-day means, we can see that higher rainfall in the wet season over those years. And the dry season happens to have much higher wind speeds. So if we look at mean wind speeds, we have them higher in the dry season consistently. If we look at maxima, the story is a little bit more complicated because yes, definitely the maximum rainfalls are all in the wet season, but we also have some spikes of really high wind speed in the wet season, even though that generally has lower average wind speeds. And those no doubt correspond to big storms that kick up big winds. If we look across the census intervals in general, we see that there's a higher disturbance rate in the wet season than in the dry season. This is consistent with what people have said for years about tree falls in this forest. Now, interestingly, people had also said that there's more disturbances in the late wet season than in the early wet season, and we did not find support for that. We found a very similar rate overall across these time periods, although there's obviously a lot of variation across time periods. Now, trying to zoom in a bit closer, we looked at, fine scale, how can we come up with statistics for a month that would capture the relevant rain and wind events. And so one of the things we did was look at the number or the kind of total for example, number of events with really high rainfall or number of time periods with really high wind speeds, per 30-day period or so forth, and then look at whether that would explain variation in canopy disturbance rates. Now, all our models at this point are phenomenological because of the limitations of the data, and ultimately, it's a huge data set, but we still only have 5 years of data with monthly data, so less than, it's only about 50 data, a little bit more than 50 data points because we have some missed ones. So if we look at one of these sorts of statistics, so in this case, a log of the frequency of 15-minute periods with rainfall greater than the 98.2 percentile, I'll get to why if we show that one later, and we plot that against the canopy disturbance rates, we see that there's a correlation with the periods with more of these high rainfall events tend to have higher disturbance rates. So we kind of just as an exploratory analysis, we basically tested a whole bunch of different thresholds for rainfall and looking at statistics at 15-minute rates. Is it high rainfall 15 minutes that matters, per hour, per day? Day is kind of a nice natural unit because it doesn't tend to rain much at night. And then we basically looked at the Pearson correlations across all of these and said, okay, well, the best predictor is happens to be this law, 15-minute periods with rainfall above the 98.2 percentile. But you can see that there's a lot of other 15-minute and 1 hour statistics that are kind of have a similar predictive ability overall in terms of explaining variation. So we do have a signal that months with high rainfall events have higher canopy disturbance rates, but it's not easy to tease out exactly what it is about that. You're probably wondering what about wind speed. So wind speed statistics, basically the ones we have were not predictive, and that's partly no doubt because the dry season has higher wind speeds, as I said, but it's the wet season when the soils are a bit more unstable and the trees are more weighted down with water, where we tend to see more of these tree fall events. And then partly, we don't have such great measurements of maximum wind speed, partly because of where the Met station is located with respect to the plot. The sonic anemometer we have close to the plot, as those of you who work with those sorts of data know. And when it's raining, you can't actually use that data because the raindrops change the speed of sound and the measurement of the wind speed. So unfortunately, the best wind speed data we have kind of is useless exactly when we need it most. So overall, this first study that came out in Biogeosciences, showed this very strong temporal variation, quantified it with data on hundreds of canopy disturbance events over 5 years in a 50-hectare plot, and showed that it was indeed related to certain climate events. I'd love to do some more follow-up with if there's anyone on this call who has expertise in working with that sort of wind and rain data or a mechanistic model that would let us drill down a bit more to try to come up with something less phenomenological and more mechanistic. We have another 3 years of data since this paper came out. It's a word that's not used in the paper. The second study I'm going to talk about is looking at the spatial aspect. So as I said before, there's evidence that across sites across the tropics, variation in biomass is driven mainly by variation in mortality. In this study led by former postdoc Casey Cushman, we basically wanted to see if the same is true at sort of landscape level scales. In this case, the scale of Barrow, Colorado Island, which is about 5 kilometers across and 5 kilometers north-south as well. So it's not a huge area, 1,500 hectares, 15 square kilometers, but it's got considerable variation in soil parent material, so geology and soil type, and there's two basically levels of forest age, a secondary forest about 120 years old and an old growth forest over 400 years old. And there's fairly complex topography, as you can see here from the curvature and the slope and the height above drainage. And the 50-hectare plot happens to be not coincidentally placed on the flattest part of the island, the easiest to work in, and the nearest big section of old growth to the lab clearing, which is up in the northeast corner of the island. So what Casey did is analyze, we had whole island drone flights in 2015, 2018, and 2020, and in July of each year, and she applied the same sort of differencing of the surface elevation models. In this case, it was actually quite a bit more complicated because there were hundreds and hundreds of photos going into the orthomosaics and the 3D point clouds instead of 10 times more basically than relative to the 50-hectare plot. The flights were taken over a longer period of time, so there were alignment issues, and there was quite a lot of pre-processing that had to be done to kind of ensure that kind of problems with the alignment weren't driving the results. But in the end, Casey figured out a good way to kind of piecewise align these and knit them together. and detect these areas of large canopy disturbances across the island. There are some areas where there was no data due to cloud cover or other issues with the reconstruction in one or both years in either end. But she was able to detect thousands of canopy disturbances in these two periods spanning a total of 5 years. And then she fit a integrated nested Laplace approximation model with spatial autocorrelation to test for the effects of different environmental variables, abiotic variables on explaining the variation we see across the site. And she found that canopy disturbances were more frequent on areas with higher slope on part two of the geologies, Camito, marine, and andesite, and in the older forests than in the secondary forest. So the secondary forest had a lower disturbance rate, which is actually consistent with a lot of other data for the tropics as well. And if we kind of just map those fixed effects across the landscape, we get this higher disturbance rates on the western part of the island and lower disturbance rates on the eastern part, and kind of the subtle variation that's mapping these fixed effect factors. The fixed effects explain considerable spatial variation of disturbance rates. I always find it a little frustrating to see graphs like this. So if we look at basically the R squared predicted at different spatial scales, this is 10 to 60 hectares, we see that just the fixed effects alone explained over 60% of the variation in disturbance rates in one of the time periods and over 50% overall. Now, not only could we explain a lot of the variation of disturbance rates, but we could also, this variation of disturbance rates in turn explained considerable variation in forest structure. So if we look at the proportion of low canopy area as the response variable and the Pearson correlation between the estimated disturbance rate and the proportion of low canopy area, and this is a low canopy area in 2009. So this is not like we're predicting what's there at the end based on what happened during the interval. We specifically looked at the variation in an earlier time period as characteristic of the landscape as a whole. And we could explain a considerable variation in basically areas with more low canopy area and higher disturbance rates. So we were explaining in this landscape level as well, there's considerable variation in tree mortality rates and canopy disturbance rates across the landscape, and that drives variation in forest structure. So in a more recent analysis done by an intern last summer, we also tested for gap contagion. So our disturbance is more likely closer to recent disturbances. There's been conflicting papers on this in the tropical forest literature. So we basically looked at recent canopy gaps here in pink and then overlaid the newer canopy gaps in black. And this analysis showed that there is a trend towards a higher, there's a pattern of higher disturbance rates next to within 10 meters or so of canopy gaps. And that's something that we're working on writing up. So ongoing research in future directions, we're working on linking disturbance data with crown maps and tree censuses to identify which trees died when and evaluate how vulnerability varies with species, size, etc. So across this orthomosaic, we've taken those individual crowns and mapped them to tag trees on the plot. Here, each of those crowns is delineated with a color that reflects its species identity. So we have over 2,000 crowns, for example, in the 2015 crown map, just including those above 25 meters squared in area, encompassing 130 different tree species. We're also expanding data collection to large areas and higher temporal resolution. We're working with collaborators on tools for automatic problem segmentation and looking into also, in the long term, we're hoping to get automatic species classification. In part with some hyperspectral imagery, or at least not every species will be amenable to that, but if we can capture some of the more common species and more distinctive species, that'll be a big step forward already. Adding laser scanning, so we already are doing some mobile laser scanning. We're hoping to add drone-based laser scanning in the next year, and working on better quantifying potential drivers and developing and parameterizing better mechanistic models of tree mortality. So in work with Evan Gora. Evan led a postdoc in the lab. He led a number of papers on tree mortality from lightning and developed a semi-mechanistic and empirically supported lightning risk model for trees in this forest. So take-home messages, understanding the rates and mechanisms of tree mortality is critical to understanding variation in forest carbon stocks in the tropics. Repeat drone photogrammetry now makes it possible to monitor tree mortality over large areas at fine temporal resolution and thereby better link mortality to thrivers. Canopy disturbances on the BCI 50 hectare plot are dominated by tree falls and positively associated with strong rainstorms. And soil type and topography explain considerable spatial variation in canopy disturbance rates across BCI. And these canopy disturbance rates explain forest structure at these landscape scales. And we do have some evidence that canopy disturbance rates are higher closer to recent canopy disturbances. So I'd like to thank the collaborators that have made this work possible, especially the postdocs Casey Cushman and Raquel Araujo, who led the two papers that I talked about. And I thank you for attention, and I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for your presentations today. We'll shortly announce the next speaker. The next speaker will be Miroslav Svoboda from Prague in Czech Republic, most likely early February. And you will be informed, like usual, via the email distributor. So thanks everyone for joining, especially thanks once more, Daniel and Helena, and see you next time.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you very much. Thanks again for the invitation.